The footage you saw just now, that's me riding completely drenched through torrential rain on a cold January night, somewhere between Amritsar and Ambala. I'll come back to that later. Hi, I'm Nikhil. I'm a service designer and an artist, and I've always loved motorcycles. The idea of riding across India started way back in 2005 when I was studying architecture. A few friends and I had decided that someday we'll own motorcycles and ride across the country, studying architecture, cities, people, just understanding India from the road. It sounded like a crazy dream. Then life happened. I worked, I designed systems, I helped businesses make decisions for their customers. Decisions about comfort, flow, safety, efficiency, and delight. And somewhere along the way, a question started bothering me. We proudly say India is diverse, we also admit it's complex. But what does that actually feel like when you're the one moving through it? As a designer, I realized something uncomfortable. Most of the time, I was wearing the expert hat. I was analyzing people, mapping journeys, finding problems. But I wasn't being the customer. So I decided to do something slightly unreasonable. I put the expert hat aside, picked up my motorcycle, and chose to experience India the way millions do every day, exposed, vulnerable, tired, and hopeful. Not to judge it, not to fix it, just to feel it. This film isn't about destinations, it's about what happens when you move. Because in India, before the system ever takes care of you, it asks something from you first. When you travel across India on a motorcycle, you realize something very early. India doesn't begin with care, it begins with load. Some days the system works beautifully: long highways, clear markings, predictable flow. Your body relaxes, your mind opens up, and you don't even notice why you feel good. Other days, the system feels unfinished: broken roads, missing railings, sudden potholes, no signs, no warnings. You ride through Mussoorie, where visibility drops to nothing, through tea estates in Munnar, where the road twists like it's alive, through steep slopes in McLeodganj, where gravity itself feels like the part of the design brief. Nature keeps reminding you that it's also a part of the system. Dried riverbeds, forests thinning out, monkeys sitting on highway dividers waiting for food instead of fruit. Even your body becomes the part of the journey map. Somewhere along the way, I sprained my wrist, burned my ankle, caught a cold, had a stomach infection bad enough to suddenly make public toilets very important. But you don't stop, you adapt. You pack better, you slow down, you learn what pain to ignore and what not to. There's a night in McLeodganj where I'm exhausted, packing my bags for the next day, barely standing, and I catch myself swaying, half dancing, half fighting sleep. That moment stayed with me because before India ever cares for you, it first asks you to endure. And how much a system loads you decides how deeply care is felt when it finally arrives. Somewhere during this journey, I realized something important. Endurance is not the problem. Indians endure every day. The real question is what happens after you have endured enough? Who notices, who responds, and how. Before I talk about people, there's one thing I need to acknowledge. This entire journey happened on one machine, the Super Meteor 650. I started the ride with a designer's question: how does a product behave when it's taken out of the ideal conditions and dropped into real life? Rain, broken roads, long hours, physical fatigue. And the honest answer is the motorcycle never became the problem. That matters because when everything else is uncertain, you need at least one system you don't have to think about. Across India, whenever the bike needed attention, I walked into a Royal Enfield service center just as another rider. Different cities, different people, same intent. The system worked quietly, the people had the freedom to help. That reliability became my baseline. And once you have a stable baseline, you start noticing how everything else behaves, especially human care. McLeodganj felt different the moment I entered. Everything there is on a slope: roads, houses, lives. Nothing is flat, nothing is easy, and yet nothing feels rushed. I stayed at a family run Tibetan hotel. The entrance was confusing, the parking awkward, the approach stressful. But once inside, the tone changed. The owner called me personally, upgraded my room, asked about my journey, my work, my book. The room had issues. A lock didn't work, a light was cracked, the phone was dead, but none of it felt hostile. It felt human. They helped me find places, spoke during meals, shared stories without trying to impress. And then I visited the Tibetan Museum. That's where something shifted. Here was a civilization that had lost its geography, pushed out of its land, still telling its story, quietly, clearly, without spectacle. No drama, no exaggeration, just dignity. I sat at the Dalai Lama temple later that day. Didn't think, didn't plan, just sat. And for the first time on the trip, I felt calm without effort. After weeks on the road, I noticed something. Care doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes it fails quietly, through a sentence, a tone, a movement that wasn't meant to hurt. Now contrast that with Lucknow. I stayed at a beautiful architect designed homestay, insulated rooms, thoughtful spaces, a place that looked like it understood comfort. But the moment I arrived, the lady of the house joked, "So, what do you even get by riding?" She laughed. I smiled. But something shut down inside me. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't malice. It was a taunt, delivered casually. And suddenly, I wasn't a guest anymore. I was being evaluated. The architect himself was kind later, invited me to his office, spent time, spoke proudly of his work. Yet, the first impression stayed, and I realized something uncomfortable. Care doesn't fail only when people are rude. It also fails when empathy is inconsistent. McLeodganj had flaws, but no judgment. Lucknow had beauty, but a moment of carelessness that lingered. Good intentions don't cancel impact, and that's when a deeper question emerged to me. If individual intent can break care so easily, how do systems survive when people are removed from the center? That's when I realized if care is this fragile at the human level, then the only way it survives at scale is when systems don't depend on personalities at all. Until this point, every experience depended on someone. Then I entered spaces that didn't need me at all. There were moments on this journey where I stopped thinking like a designer. I stopped evaluating, stopped comparing. I simply stood inside systems that had outlived everyone in them. One of those moments was in Varanasi. At Manikarnika Ghat, death is not hidden, it is organized. There are rules, there are steps, there is rhythm. No one explains it to you, yet nothing feels chaotic. People work without emotion, not because they don't feel, but because the system cannot afford performance. You realize something unsettling. This place doesn't need you to understand it, it just needs you not to interrupt it. I didn't feel spiritual, I didn't feel disturbed, I felt neutral, and that neutrality stayed with me. In a completely different part of the country, I felt the same thing again, this time in Amritsar. Inside the langar, there are no instructions. You enter, you watch, you join. Someone shows you how to do a task, then steps away. No praise, no supervision, no ownership. At first, I tried to be efficient, then I stopped trying. The system didn't need me to be good, it needs me to continue. When I left, nothing paused, nothing acknowledged me. And that was the point. These systems don't survive because of belief, they survive because ego has no function inside them. No one is the center, no one is essential, and yet everything keeps moving. These systems didn't survive because they were sacred, they survived because they were designed to continue. And that made me wonder, why don't we allow everyday systems the same freedom to care? If egoless systems show us how things can run, small towns showed me who is allowed to care. I didn't expect to remember Adilabad. It was a small town, one street, no promise of anything special. The hotel itself was simple, two floors or three, I think, converted from a residential building. But the moment I arrived, I felt noticed. Not watched, not managed, just noticed. They saw me unloading luggage on the road and stepped in without being asked. They offered me a choice of rooms, not because I demanded it, but because they could. When I mentioned I was doing a book and a film, they didn't question it or upsell it. They adjusted around it. That night, I stepped out barefoot to buy a chocolate. I was missing my family. It was New Year's Eve. The manager didn't tell me where the shop was. He asked what I wanted and sent it to my door. Later, when I tagged them on Instagram, they replied, "Your family today." And that stayed with me. Not because it was emotional, but because it was effortless. They didn't need approval, they didn't need escalation, they didn't need a rule book. They had permission from ownership, from the system, and from themselves to act like humans. What surprised me wasn't that Adilabad worked, it was how easily care disappeared when control increased. Now contrast that with Hyderabad. The stay there was good on paper, the house was large, well maintained, the room was large too, everything worked, but the owner was always present. Not hostile, not rude, just hovering. Conversations felt monitored, choices felt observed, comfort slowly shrank. I realized something uncomfortable. Even when systems are good, control kills generosity. People stop acting freely when they are being watched too closely. They stop improvising. They stop caring beyond obligation. In Adilabad, nobody was trying to manage my experience. In Hyderabad, someone was trying to own it. And the difference wasn't money, literacy, or scale. That's when I realized care doesn't need training as much as it needs trust, which made me ask, what happens when identity itself becomes more important than service? Jaipur looks magnificent. Wide roads, pink facades, grand palaces. On paper, it should have felt incredible, but riding there was exhausting. The roads were wide, yet chaotic. The traffic had no rhythm. Everyone moved as if rules were optional. Inside the Heritage Hotel, the contrast continued. The front desk was warm, the security staff smiled every time they saw me, but the kitchen staff treated service like a burden. The rooms were small, the experience felt staged. Even at the city palace, I found myself overwhelmed by opulence and strangely untouched by it. I kept asking myself, am I missing something? Or is something missing here? A few days later, I reached Udaipur. The difference was immediate. The city felt calmer, more breathable. I stayed at a fort which wasn't perfect. Parts needed repair, some details were worn. But the caretaker, Shivji, changed everything. He noticed problems before I complained, fixed them immediately, spoke with pride, not performance, about the place. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he could help, he did fully. Even the royal family, when they met me, listened. Not defensively, not ceremonially. They were curious. In Udaipur, history wasn't being sold, it was being shared. In Jaipur, identity felt like a costume. In Udaipur, it felt like inheritance. One resisted and adopted, the other absorbed and displayed. Neither is right or wrong. But as a guest, I felt the difference in my body. One made me alert and cynical, the other made me slow down and stay longer. By the time I left Udaipur, I wasn't thinking about heritage anymore. I was thinking about something simpler. When systems grow larger, do they still remember who they are for? By the time I reached Nagpur, I had stayed in many places. Some beautiful, some uncomfortable, some expensive, some forgettable. Nagpur wasn't meant to be memorable. It was just a simple Airbnb in an old bungalow. One house, one host, no branding. No ambition to impress, but everything worked. Instructions were clear. Communication was simple. Decisions were easy. One place to message, one person accountable, clear boundaries. I didn't have to figure things out. I could just be a guest. And that mattered more than I expected. Now contrast this with Gokarna. On paper, the hostel was impressive. 4 floors, ocean facing, young crowd, designed experience. But the moment I checked in, friction started showing. 3 different apps. One for booking, one for access, one for communication. None of them talking to each other. The staff wanted to help, I could see that. But they had almost no power. Rules existed but weren't enforced. Quiet hours were written but ignored. Shared spaces were planned to maximize beds, not comfort. Rooms were tight, circulation was awkward, noise traveled everywhere. It felt like the building was designed to extract value, not to host humans. And the irony was sharp. A large system with more money, more tech, more scale felt fragile. A single house in Nagpur felt solid. Not because it was luxurious, but because the system was simple, humane, and honest. That's when it hit me. Complexity isn't sophistication. Technology isn't care. When systems grow without empathy, they stop serving people and start defending themselves. And as a guest, you feel it immediately, even if you can't explain it. That contrast stayed with me because the most fragile systems on this journey weren't the oldest ones, they were the ones pretending to be smart. And that brought me back to that night I started this film with. Remember the rain from the beginning? That wasn't an opening shot. That was the unresolved question. It was January, cold, dark. I was riding from Amritsar to Ambala. Visibility was near zero. My gloves were soaked. The body was exhausted. At some point, this stopped being a ride and became survival. I pulled into a McDonald's not because I wanted food, but because it was there. The staff didn't ask questions, they didn't panic. They gave me napkins, hot tea with sugar, a place to sit. Not as a favor, but as a part of the system. Then the hotel, late night, unplanned. I must have looked terrible. The staff checked me in quietly, got me towels, helped me dry my gear. No speeches, no heroics, just care. Enabled by systems that allowed people to act human. That night, nothing extraordinary happened, and that's the point. Because when systems are designed well, care doesn't need permission. I started this journey wearing two hats, one of a designer, one of a customer. What I learned wasn't about India being good or bad, it was about this. Systems alone don't save us, people alone burn out. But when systems are built to support human intent, even in chaos, they quietly hold us together. I didn't come back with answers. I came back with responsibility to design less impressively and more honestly. To build systems that don't dominate people but back them up. Somewhere between care and chaos is where I now choose to design from.